The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi. As Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood rigid against the Pacific wind, it was June 4th, 1942, and the taste of victory still lingered from Pearl Harbor 6 months prior. The combined fleet had swept through the Pacific like an unstoppable tsunami, crushing resistance from Wake Island to the Dutch East Indies. Now, Midway atoll lay ahead, a tiny speck of coral and sand that would serve as the stepping stone to Hawaii itself. Nagumo adjusted his white gloves and surveyed the four massive carriers under his command. Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, each vessel bristled with the finest aircraft the Empire could produce. Mitsubishi Zero fighters that had proven themselves masters of the sky, Nakajima torpedo bombers that had crippled the American Pacific Fleet, and Aichi dive bombers that struck with the precision of falling lightning. Over 200 aircraft in total, crewed by pilots whose skill had been honed in the crucible of China and perfected in the opening months of the Pacific War. The plan was flawless in its simplicity, a testament to Japanese naval doctrine that had dominated Asian waters for decades. Vice Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor and mastermind of this operation, had conceived it as the final blow against American naval power. First, a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands would draw American forces north. Then, the main striking force would pulverize Midway's defenses before the Americans could react. When the remnants of the United States Pacific Fleet rushed to defend their forward base, they would sail directly into the waiting guns of the combined fleet. According to Naval War College records, the Japanese believed their intelligence estimates showed minimal American resistance at Midway. Commander Minoru Genda, Nagumo's air operations officer, climbed to the bridge with the confident stride of a man who had never known defeat. His pilots had trained for months for this moment, studying detailed models of Midway's installations, memorizing every gun emplacement and runway. They would strike with overwhelming force at 0600 hours, clearing the way for invasion transports already steaming toward the atoll. Below deck, Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki gathered his bomber crews for final briefings. Maps of Midway covered every available surface, marked with red circles indicating primary targets, the airfield, fuel dumps, and defensive positions. The young pilots listened intently, their faces reflecting the same supreme confidence that had carried them from triumph to triumph across the Pacific. They had faced American pilots before and found them wanting brave perhaps, but lacking the spiritual discipline and tactical superiority that made Japanese aviators invincible. As the strike force prepared for launch, radio operators aboard the flagship intercepted scattered American communications. The traffic seemed routine, giving no indication that Admiral Chester Nimitz and his codebreakers had already penetrated the heart of Japanese naval communications. Unknown to Nagumo and his staff, American intelligence had been reading their operational orders for weeks, turning Yamamoto's carefully planned surprise into a deadly trap. The first Zeros began their engines, sending vibrations through the steel deck plates. Mechanics made last-minute adjustments while ordnance crews armed the bombers with high explosive and incendiary bombs specifically chosen to devastate Midway's facilities. Everything proceeded according to doctrine, following procedures that had delivered victory after victory. The Japanese naval establishment had created what they believed to be the perfect weapon, a concentrated carrier strike force that could project devastating power across vast distances of ocean. As the sun climbed higher, casting the fleet in brilliant morning light, no one aboard the Japanese carriers could imagine that their doctrine of overwhelming first strikes and superior training was about to collide with an enemy that had learned from defeat and prepared for redemption. The roar of aircraft engines shattered the morning calm as 108 Japanese planes lifted from the decks of the four carriers. Commander Shimazaki led the formation toward Midway, his bombers flanked by protective fighters whose pilots scanned the empty sky with predatory confidence. The atoll appeared on the horizon as a thin line of white sand and green vegetation, seemingly defenseless against the approaching storm of steel and fire. At 0630 hours, The first wave struck Midway with devastating precision. Aichi. Dive bombers screamed down from 12,000 feet, their sirens wailing like banshees as they released their deadly cargo. Explosions erupted across the island as fuel tanks ignited in towering. Columns of black smoke and concrete bunkers cracked under the impact of armor-piercing bombs. The power plant disappeared in a brilliant flash, while the hospital and several buildings housing Marine defenders crumbled into rubble. But even as Japanese bombs tore through Midway's facilities, something unexpected was unfolding. American fighters, obsolete Brewster Buffaloes, and a handful of newer Grumman Wildcats rose to meet the attackers despite the odds against them. Marine pilots like Captain John Carey and Lieutenant William Brooks threw their aircraft into desperate combat, trading altitude for speed as they dove into the perfectly organized Japanese formations. The sky above Midway erupted into a chaotic melee of twisting aircraft and tracer fire. Japanese Zeros, superior in every measurable way, began their deadly dance with American defenders who possessed nothing but courage and determination. One by one, the outclassed American fighters fell from the sky, but not before inflicting unexpected damage on the supposedly invincible Japanese formation. As documented in official Marine Corps' historical records, 23 of the 26 American fighters that engaged the Japanese formation were shot down, but their sacrifice disrupted the planned bombing pattern. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, leading the bomber formation, circled the smoking atoll and assessed the damage through his canopy. While significant destruction was evident across Midway's installations, he could see that the runways remained operational, and many defensive positions had survived the attack. More concerning, radio intercepts indicated that American aircraft had escaped destruction and might attempt counterattacks against the Japanese fleet. As Tomonaga's formation began its return flight to the carriers, he made a fateful radio transmission that would echo through history. There is need for a second attack wave. The message crackled through the static to Admiral Nagumo aboard Akagi, where it struck the fleet commander like a physical blow. Doctrine called for a single devastating strike that would eliminate all resistance. The need for a second attack suggested that American defenses were stronger than intelligence had indicated. Meanwhile, radar operators on Midway had detected the incoming Japanese strike long before it arrived. This precious warning had allowed many aircraft to escape destruction by taking off before the bombs fell. Now, as the Japanese formation withdrew, these surviving American planes prepared for their own desperate counterattack against the enemy. Fleet. At 0700 hours, 6 Navy Avenger torpedo bombers and 4 Army Air Force B-26 Marauders raced toward the Japanese carriers at wave-top height. These aircraft, hastily armed and crewed by pilots with minimal training on their new equipment, represented America's first counterstrike against the seemingly invincible combined fleet. The Japanese fleet's defensive screen reacted with lethal efficiency as the American attackers approached. Zeros diving from combat air patrol altitude tore into the low-flying bombers, while anti-aircraft fire from destroyers and cruisers created deadly walls of exploding steel. The ocean surface erupted in geysers of water as shells and bullets sought their targets. One by one, the brave American crews pressed their attacks despite impossible odds. Torpedo after torpedo splashed into the sea as their aircraft were shot down short of their targets. The few that managed to reach the carriers found their weapons running beneath the massive ships, or failing to explode upon impact. Within minutes, the first American counterattack had been virtually annihilated. But aboard Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced a decision that would test the very foundations of Japanese naval doctrine. His second-wave aircraft sat on the hangar decks, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for attacks against enemy ships. Tomonaga's request for another strike on Midway would require rearming these planes with different ordnance, a time-consuming process that would leave the fleet vulnerable. Admiral Nagumo stood in Akagi's flag bridge, the weight of command pressing down upon his shoulders like the humid Pacific air. Before him lay intelligence reports, aerial photographs, and the stark reality of Tomonaga's assessment that Midway required another attack. The morning's strike had wounded the American base, but had not delivered the knockout blow that Japanese doctrine demanded. The decision tormented him. On the hangar decks below, his second-wave aircraft waited with their deadly cargo of torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, weapons specifically chosen for destroying enemy warships. These were the teeth of his fleet's anti-shipping capability, held in reserve for the moment when American naval forces appeared on the horizon. But Tomonaga's urgent message demanded immediate action against Midway's surviving defenses. At 07:15 hours, Nagumo made his choice. He ordered the second-wave aircraft to be rearmed with high-explosive and incendiary bombs for another attack on Midway, immediately. The hangar decks of all four carriers erupted into frenzied activity as ordnance crews began the laborious process of switching armaments. Torpedoes were removed and replaced with bombs, while armor-piercing projectiles gave way to high-explosive ordnance designed to shatter buildings and runways. The rearming process would take at least an hour precious time, during which the fleet remained vulnerable. But Nagumo consoled himself with the knowledge that American naval forces were hundreds of miles away, racing northward toward the Aleutians where Japanese diversionary attacks were already underway. His intelligence officers had assured him that no significant American fleet units remained in the Central Pacific. According to Imperial Japanese Navy operational records analyzed by post-war historians, this rearming decision represented a fundamental departure from established doctrine, requiring constant readiness against surface threats. As aircraft mechanics and ordnance specialists worked frantically below deck, the returning Midway strike force began landing operations. Tomonaga's bombers and fighters approached the fleet in perfect formation, their fuel gauges approaching empty after the long round trip to the atoll. The carriers turned into the wind, their flight decks cleared for recovery operations. But at 07:28 hours, a lookout aboard the cruiser Tone spotted something that made his blood freeze. On the northern horizon, barely visible through the morning haze, dark specks were approaching at low altitude. Within moments, the fleet's alert klaxons were wailing across the water as 18 American dive bombers Douglas Dauntless aircraft from Midway began their attack run. The American pilots, led by Major Lofton Henderson of the Marine Corps, had found the Japanese fleet despite having minimal training on their unfamiliar aircraft. Henderson himself had never flown a Dauntless in combat, yet he led his mixed formation of Marines and Navy pilots in a desperate attempt to strike at the heart of Japanese naval power. Japanese anti-aircraft fire erupted from every ship in the formation as the Americans began their diving attacks. The sky filled with black puffs of exploding shells while tracers created deadly geometric patterns. Against the blue morning sky, Henderson's aircraft, struck by multiple hits, began trailing smoke as he pressed his attack against the carrier. "Hear you!" The Marine Major's Dauntless, now engulfed in flames, continued its dive toward the carrier's flight deck. At the last moment, Henderson pulled out of his attack run and crashed into the sea just short of his target, his bomb exploding harmlessly in the water. One by one, his fellow pilots followed him down, their aircraft torn apart by the concentrated, defensive fire of the entire Japanese fleet. Yet even as the American attack failed to score a single hit, it had achieved something far more valuable than material damage. The need to evade the diving bombers had forced the Japanese carriers to break formation and maneuver independently. More critically, the attack had consumed precious time and created chaos on the flight decks where aircraft were being rearmed and refueled. Admiral Nagumo watched the last American aircraft disappear beneath the waves and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. His fleet had beaten off another desperate American attack without suffering damage. But his confidence began to erode when his communications officer handed him an intercepted radio message that would change everything. At 07:45 hours, a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft reported sighting American naval forces to the northeast. 10 ships, including what appeared to be aircraft carriers. The report struck the flag bridge like a thunderbolt. American carriers were supposed to be far away, chasing phantoms in the Aleutians. Their presence here meant that the entire Japanese operational plan had been compromised. Nagumo stared at the message in disbelief. His aircraft were in the middle of being rearmed for another strike on Midway. His returning strike force needed immediate recovery, and now he faced the possibility of a major fleet engagement with his forces scattered and unprepared. The radio message crackled with static as the reconnaissance pilot's voice cut through the morning air. Enemy force of 10 ships, bearing 10 degrees, distanced 140 miles from Midway. Admiral Nagumo felt the deck plates vibrate beneath his feet as Akagi's engines drove her through the swelling Pacific. But his mind reeled from the implications of this devastating intelligence. Commander Genda rushed to the flag bridge with additional reports streaming in from other reconnaissance aircraft. The American force was larger than initially reported and appeared to include multiple aircraft carriers, the very ships that were supposed to be hundreds of miles away. Drawn off by the Aleutian diversion, the carefully orchestrated Japanese plan was unraveling with each passing minute. Below deck, the rearming operations had reached a critical phase. Bombs and torpedoes lay scattered across hangar decks as ordnance crews worked with desperate efficiency. Fuel lines snaked between aircraft as mechanics topped off tanks for the planned second strike on Midway. The carriers had become floating arsenals, packed with high explosives and aviation fuel that could detonate at the slightest spark. At 0800 hours, Nagumo faced the most crucial decision of his naval career. His first strike aircraft were returning from Midway with fuel gauges showing empty and battle damage requiring immediate attention. The second wave was half rearmed for another attack on the atoll. And now, American carriers lurked somewhere beyond the horizon, their own strike forces potentially already airborne and racing toward the Japanese fleet. Japanese doctrine provided clear guidance. For such situations, maintain offensive momentum and strike first. But doctrine assumed adequate preparation time and proper intelligence luxuries that Nagumo no longer possessed. He could launch an immediate attack with whatever aircraft were available, or he could recover his returning planes and properly prepare a coordinated strike against the newly discovered American fleet. As documented in the official Japanese naval staff history, this decision point represented the critical moment where tactical flexibility should have overridden rigid operational planning. The admiral chose caution over aggression, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered the recovery of the Midway strike force to proceed, postponing any attacks until a proper coordinated assault could be organized. The carriers maintained their defensive formation while Zeros, Kates, and Vols landed one after another on flight decks that had become increasingly congested with aircraft, fuel, and ordnance. Meanwhile, 300 miles to the northeast, American naval forces were preparing their own strike. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the carrier Enterprise, had received confirmation of the Japanese fleet's position from Midway-based reconnaissance aircraft. His two carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, along with Admiral Frank Fletcher's Yorktown, represented the concentrated striking power of what remained of the American Pacific Fleet. The American commanders faced their own agonizing decisions. Their aircraft would have to fly at maximum range to reach the Japanese carriers, leaving little fuel for combat maneuvering or the return flight. Timing was critical: launch too early, and the strike would arrive piecemeal; too late, and the Japanese might escape or launch their own devastating attack first. At 0836 hours, Spruance made his decision. Despite being at extreme range, he would launch everything available immediately. The risk was enormous, but the opportunity to catch the Japanese carriers with their aircraft on deck might never come again. Launch the attack became the order that would echo through American naval history. From Enterprise and Hornet, Dauntless dive bombers, Devastator torpedo planes, and Wildcat fighters began lifting off in the largest American carrier strike of the war. The aircraft formed up in loose formations and turned southwest toward their distant targets, carrying with them the hopes of a nation still reeling from the disasters of Pearl Harbor and the Philippines. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, calculated courses and fuel consumption as his formation climbed toward their cruising altitude. Behind him, 37 dive bombers carried 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs capable of penetrating a carrier's flight deck and detonating in the hangar spaces below. It would be the longest carrier strike in naval history, a desperate gamble against overwhelming odds. As the American strike force disappeared into the morning haze, Japanese radar operators remained focused on possible threats from Midway. Their equipment, primitive by later standards, could not detect the approaching aircraft at such extreme range. The element of surprise, lost to the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, was about to shift dramatically in favor of the Americans. The morning sun climbed higher as Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's formation of Enterprise dive bombers searched the empty Pacific for their targets. Fuel gauges showed the point of no return had passed. There was barely enough aviation gasoline remaining for the flight home, assuming they could find the Japanese carriers and attack quickly. Behind McCluskey, 37 Dauntless aircraft carried the concentrated striking power of American naval aviation, each pilot aware that failure meant not only their own deaths, but potentially the loss of the war in the Pacific. At 0920 hours, McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast at high speed, its wake creating a white arrow pointing across the blue ocean. Intuition told him this vessel was rushing to rejoin the main fleet, and he altered course to follow its heading. The decision would prove to be one of the most significant navigational choices in naval history. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese carriers, organized chaos reigned as flight operations continued. Admiral Nagumo's returning Midway strike force had been recovered, but many aircraft required immediate maintenance and refueling. The hangar decks of Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu overflowed with planes ordnance and fuel lines as crews prepared for the anticipated strike against the American fleet. At 0955 hours, lookouts aboard multiple Japanese ships simultaneously spotted aircraft approaching from the northeast. The formations were still too distant to identify, but their heading and altitude suggested hostile intent. Alert klaxons began wailing across the fleet as anti-aircraft crews rushed to their battle stations and fighter controllers vectored combat air patrol Zeros toward the incoming threat. The first American attack came from Hornet's torpedo squadron, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. 15 obsolete Devastator aircraft approached the Japanese fleet at wavetop height, their crews knowing they faced almost certain death. Waldron had defied orders and taken a direct course to the enemy, arriving alone and without fighter escort over the most heavily defended naval formation in the Pacific. According to surviving Japanese accounts compiled by naval historians, the sight of American torpedo planes attacking without escort was initially interpreted as either supreme confidence or complete desperation. Zero fighters dove from altitude, like hawks descending on their prey, their cannons and machine guns tearing through the slow, vulnerable American aircraft. The ocean surface erupted in geysers as anti-aircraft fire from destroyers and cruisers created walls of exploding steel. One by one, Waldron's aircraft were shot down, their crews dying in flaming wreckage or drowning in the oil-slicked water. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, floated in the water and watched in horror as his 14 squadron mates perished around him. Their sacrifice seemed meaningless. Not a single torpedo had found its target, and the Japanese fleet continued its deadly dance of evasion with apparent invulnerability. But the torpedo attacks, though unsuccessful, had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level and scattered the fleet's defensive formation. As Enterprise's torpedo squadron pressed its own doomed attack, every Japanese fighter was engaged at low altitude, leaving the high-altitude approaches UNDEFE and DED. At exactly 10:24 hours, Lieutenant Commander McCluskey's dive bombers appeared at 14,000 feet directly above the Japanese carriers. The sight below was a naval aviator's dream for massive carriers steaming in formation, their flight decks packed with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. The Japanese had achieved perfect vulnerability at the worst possible moment. McCluskey selected Kaga as his primary target and pushed over into his attack dive, followed by the entire Enterprise bombing squadron. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led Yorktown's dive bombers against Soryu, while other formations targeted the remaining carriers. The sky filled with screaming Dauntless aircraft as American naval aviation finally struck back. With devastating effect, the The first bomb struck Kaga's flight deck amidships, penetrating to the hangar deck where it detonated among fueled and armed aircraft. The explosion triggered a chain reaction of secondary detonations that turned the carrier into an inferno within seconds. Aviation gasoline fed the flames, while exploding ordnance sent fragments tearing through bulkheads and personnel. Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, suffered a similar fate as Lieutenant Dick Best's 1,000-pound bomb punched through her flight deck and exploded in the upper hangar. The blast killed dozens of aircrew and maintenance personnel, while igniting fuel fires that quickly spread throughout the ship. Within minutes, the pride of the Japanese carrier fleet was transformed into a blazing pyre. Soryu absorbed multiple bomb hits that devastated her island's superstructure and flight operations facilities. Her captain, realizing the ship was doomed, ordered abandon ship as fires consumed everything above the waterline. The carrier that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor was now dying in the Pacific swells. Her aircraft and experienced aircrews lost forever. In less than 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers had been mortally wounded. The doctrine of concentrated carrier operations, which had delivered victory after victory across the Pacific, had become a fatal vulnerability when faced with a coordinated enemy attack. Through the acrid smoke drifting across the Pacific, Admiral Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge and witnessed the destruction of his fleet. Kaga blazed like a torch on the northern horizon while Soryu listed heavily to starboard, her flight deck shattered and her hangars erupting in secondary explosions. His own flagship shuddered as damage control parties fought desperately to contain the fires raging below deck. But the sweet smell of aviation gasoline and the heat radiating from the hangar spaces told him that Akagi was dying. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had escaped the initial American attack by virtue of being separated from the main formation. During evasive maneuvers, Captain Tomio Kaku drove his ship northward at flank speed while his air operations officer, Commander Kawaguchi, prepared an immediate counterstrike with whatever aircraft remained operational. 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters represented the last offensive capability of the once mighty 1st Air Fleet. At 1100 hours, Hiryu's strike force launched toward the American carriers, whose approximate position had been reported by a surviving reconnaissance aircraft. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the formation southwest, knowing that his small force carried the honor of the Imperial Navy, and perhaps the fate of the entire Pacific campaign. The American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown steamed in defensive formation as their returning strike aircraft began landing operations. Fuel gauges showed critical levels, and several dauntless bombers were forced to ditch in the ocean when their engines quit short of. The carriers, the Mornings, attack had achieved stunning success, but at enormous cost in aircraft and trained aircrew. As recorded in official U.S. Navy action reports, the fuel situation was so critical that several pilots landed with less than 10 gallons remaining in their tanks. Admiral Fletcher, commanding from Yorktown, watched his radar screens with growing concern as unidentified aircraft approached from the northwest. The Japanese were striking back, and his fleet had to be ready. Fighter directors vectored Wildcat interceptors toward the incoming raid, while damage control parties prepared for the inevitable battle damage. At noon, Kobayashi's formation found the American task force and immediately began their attack runs. Japanese dive bombers screamed down through a sky filled with anti-aircraft fire, their pilots displaying the same skill and determination that had made them masters of the Pacific. 3 bombs struck Yorktown in rapid succession, penetrating her flight deck and starting fires in her forward magazine spaces. The old carrier, veteran of the Coral Sea battle and hastily repaired at Pearl Harbor, absorbed the punishment with typical American damage control efficiency. Her crew fought the fires while maintaining enough speed to continue flight operations. Within 2 hours, Yorktown was back to launching and recovering aircraft, a testament to American engineering and SEAMA NSHIP. But Hiryu was not finished. At 30 hours, a second strike of 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters launched from the surviving Japanese carrier, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who had led the morning attack on Midway despite a damaged fuel tank. volunteered to lead this final assault. Knowing he lacked sufficient fuel for the return flight, the second Japanese attack found Yorktown again and pressed home their assault with suicidal determination. 2 torpedoes struck the carrier's port side, flooding her engine rooms and bringing her to a dead stop. The ship began listing heavily as electrical power failed, and damage control efforts became increasingly desperate. Admiral Fletcher was forced to transfer his flag to the cruiser Astoria as Yorktown's crew abandoned their mortally wounded ship. The carrier that had helped win the Battle of the Coral Sea was now dying in the Pacific, a victim of Japanese skill and determination even in the face of overwhelming defeat. But even as Yorktown settled deeper into the water, American search planes had located the last Japanese carrier. At 3 o'clock, Enterprise launched 24 dive bombers led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher toward Hiryu's reported position. The afternoon sun glinted off their wings as they climbed toward their target, carrying the final chapter of the day's battle. Hiryu fought alone now, her combat air patrol reduced to a handful of Zeros while her flight deck crew prepared the last few operational aircraft for another strike. Captain Kaku knew his ship was doomed. The Americans would keep coming until every Japanese carrier was destroyed. But honor demanded that he fight to the end, extracting whatever price he could from the enemy. At 5 o'clock, Gallagher's dive bombers found Hiryu steaming at high speed in a desperate attempt to escape. The Japanese carrier twisted and turned in violent evasive maneuvers, her anti-aircraft guns creating a dome of exploding steel around her vital spaces. But American bombs found their target with deadly accuracy, penetrating her flight deck and igniting the same catastrophic fires that had consumed her sister ships. Within minutes, Hiryu was blazing from stem to stern, her magazines exploding in brilliant flashes that could be seen for miles. The last carrier of the First Air Fleet was dying, taking with her the dreams of Japanese Pacific dominance and the lives of hundreds of irreplaceable aircrew and maintenance specialists. As twilight settled over the Pacific battlefield on June 4, 1942, the ocean burned with the funeral pyres of Japanese naval power. For aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu lay broken and blazing in the swells, their steel hulls cracked by internal explosions and their proud battle flags consumed by flames that had once seemed impossible to imagine. Admiral Yamamoto received the catastrophic reports aboard his flagship Yamato, positioned 300 miles to the west with the main battle fleet. The architect of Pearl Harbor read each message with growing disbelief. As the scope of the disaster became clear, in a single day, Japan had lost for fleet carriers over 300 aircraft, and most critically, the experienced aircrew who represented years of training and combat experience. The doctrine that had dominated Japanese naval thinking since the Russo-Japanese War lay in ruins. Along with the burning carriers, the concept of decisive battle, the faith in superior training and spiritual strength, the belief that offensive action could overcome any defensive preparation, all had crumbled under the weight of American determination and superior intelligence. Contemporary Japanese naval records, as analyzed by post-war military historians, reveal that the loss of experienced aircrew was considered even more devastating than the material destruction of the carriers themselves. Captain Kaku stood on Hiryu's bridge as his ship settled deeper into the water, her compartments flooding despite the desperate efforts of damage control parties. Around him, the remnants of his crew prepared for the final moments, their faces reflecting the same discipline that had carried them through months of victory. When the order came to abandon ship, they moved with quiet efficiency, helping wounded shipmates into life rafts while their vessel died beneath them. The surviving Japanese destroyer captains faced an agonizing decision. As they approached the burning carriers, doctrine demanded that they attempt to save what could be saved, but the massive fires and internal explosions made rescue operations nearly impossible. One by one, they were forced to watch as the pride of the combined fleet slipped beneath, the waves taking with them the dreams of Pacific conquest. Admiral Spruance, now commanding the American task force after Fletcher's transfer from the damaged Yorktown, weighed his options as night fell over the battlefield. His aircraft had achieved the impossible, the destruction of the most powerful carrier force in the world, but at enormous cost. Many of his most experienced pilots had been lost in the long-range attacks, and his remaining aircraft barely had enough fuel to operate. The temptation to pursue the retreating Japanese fleet was enormous, but Spruance chose caution over glory. His primary mission had been to defend Midway, and that objective was now secure. Rather than risk his remaining carriers in a night action against superior Japanese surface forces, he withdrew to the northeast, preserving American naval strength for future battles. As dawn broke on June 5th, the true magnitude of the Japanese defeat became apparent. The combined fleet, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, was retreating westward with its offensive capability shattered. The invasion transports heading for Midway received orders to reverse course, their mission now impossible without air cover. In Tokyo, the news of the defeat struck the naval staff like a physical blow. The same officers who had celebrated the victories at Pearl Harbor, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines now faced the reality that their doctrine of decisive battle had been turned against them with devastating effect. The Americans had absorbed the lessons of defeat and emerged stronger, while Japanese tactical inflexibility had proven fatal when faced with an adaptable enemy. The Battle of Midway marked the end of Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific and the beginning of America's long march toward victory. The doctrine that had seemed invincible in December 1941 lay buried beneath the Pacific swells. Along with for aircraft carriers and the flower of Japanese naval aviation, years later, surviving Japanese officers would study the battle and identify the fatal flaws that had doomed their fleet: inadequate intelligence, rigid tactical thinking, and the failure to adapt when faced with unexpected circumstances. But on that June morning in 1942, as the last survivors were pulled from the oil-slicked water, the only certainty was that the war in the Pacific had fundamentally changed. The counterattack at Midway had indeed unfolded without mercy, but the mercy denied was to Japanese dreams of empire rather than American hopes for survival. And for days of desperate fighting, the balance of naval power had shifted irreversibly, and the doctrine that had carried Japan to early victory had become the instrument of its ultimate defeat. The sun set on June 6th over empty seas where once the most powerful naval force in history had steamed toward what its commanders believed would be certain victory. Instead, they had found only the harsh judgment of war and the immutable truth that even the most perfect doctrine must eventually face the test of battle, and sometimes that test proves fatal.